The city of Lisbon, November the 1st, 1755. All Saints' Day. One of the most important days in the Christian calendar. The date of one of the greatest disasters of modern times. 60,000 people will die in a single day. Scientists are still trying to pinpoint the source of that quake. Today, the ocean threatens Europe with another huge disaster. An earthquake followed by a tsunami, the ultimate combination, striking with a speed and power that astonishes even the experts. In Lisbon in 1755, one man took control and rebuilt the city. How would we cope today? Lisbon, the capital of Portugal on the western edge of Europe, the greatest harbor on the Atlantic seaboard. Today, the pearl on the River Tagus seems a completely normal city. Yet she hides a terrible secret. It's hard to find any buildings here more than 250 years old. Rare survivors of a colossal disaster. Friday, 31st of October, 1755, the night before All Saints' Day. Halloween. Gypsies and showmen have taken over the city. Portugal may be a deeply Catholic country, but there'll be plenty of time for church-going and piety tomorrow. A day that will throw all Europe into turmoil. Off the south coast of Portugal, a team of marine scientists are searching for traces of a disaster in the past to help prevent one in the future. 100 kilometers out in the Atlantic, they're probing and measuring the ocean floor. 3 continental plates converge here. Seismically, this is a highly active area.
I think the best is to move here.
Valenti Sarayes and Marc-André Gutscher are plotting their route along the Azores-Gibraltar fault zone. This sector has seen not just sea quakes, but also tsunamis, giant waves that have claimed thousands of victims. And Europe is especially vulnerable.
The Mediterranean area, the problem is that the time of hitting of a tsunami from the source to the coast is very short, much shorter than in the Pacific or in many places in the world. So the classical alarm systems doesn't work very well. So one of the main objectives of this project is to find an alarm system which is adequate for so short timing.
More than 300 tsunamis have hit Europe and North Africa since records began 4 centuries ago. At Messina in Sicily, waves 30 meters high killed 80,000 people in 1908. There was no warning. In Lisbon, on the 1st of November 1755, a clear and sunny autumn day. Everything is running like clockwork. The king attends early mass. Joseph I has been on the throne for 5 years. He's a mediocre king, but he has talented advisors. Above all, his chancellor Marquess Pombal, a product of the Enlightenment. His rival, the Jesuit priest Malagrida, an enemy of progress. The less the people know, the more power flows to the church.
I know.
With the mass over, the king departs for his country estate at Belém, outside the city. By the time he arrives, his guests will all be here. for the royal picnic. It's a gathering of Lisbon's fabulously wealthy nobles who've been exploiting the gold mines and slaves of Brazil for generations. But Portugal's economy has been stagnating for decades. No one knows that better than Marquis Pombal. He's not popular at court. He's stayed away from today's celebrations to hold meetings in the city. His great fear is that Portugal will become the most backward backwater of all Europe. Portugal manufactures almost nothing. A quarter of all trade is in the hands of the British, with German merchants in second place. Carl Peterson is one of them. He's a Protestant, so he'll work on this Catholic holiday, but he'll have to wait for his latest cargo to be released by customs. On All Saints' Day, things take longer. Feast days and celebrations in Portugal are more important than work. Down on the quayside next to the Royal Palace, the brand new Opera House is the pride of the city. The king has had it built for 200,000 English pounds, $50 million today. This is engineering state of the art. The cogs and levers may still need human muscles to work them, but they can recreate any natural or supernatural phenomenon. Actors flying through the sky, rainstorms, volcanoes, with unprecedented realism. It sets new standards for the whole of Europe. The stage is big enough to accommodate a coach and 6 trotting horses. But already critics are rumbling that the king cares for nothing but theatre and religion. In the city, the churches are full to overflowing. The people of Lisbon are famous for their piety and their superstition. The Inquisition has ruled here for 200 years. Later today, there'll be a special attraction, an auto da fe, with heretics burned at the stake. The perfect ending to All Saints' Day, the Inquisition showing how God punishes unbelievers. The sumptuous interiors of God's houses reflect the power of the church too. No wonder they say, if you haven't seen Lisbon, you haven't seen beauty. The great city is famous for 2 things: the veneration of saints, sometimes verging on idolatry, and its legendary wealth. 1,000 ships a year tie up in Lisbon's harbour, loaded with spices and precious goods from the old and new worlds. When gold was discovered in Brazil, the King of Portugal became the richest monarch in Europe. But the ships that bring 15 tons of gold to Lisbon every year cross a dangerous stretch of ocean. The one the scientists on the Hesperides are patrolling today. They have 5 kilometers of sea beneath them, but with the latest technology, they can see into the very depths to scan the fault zones on the ocean floor.
A swath mapping system uses very high frequency waves of 15 kilohertz, which are emitted from the vessel. They go through the water, they hit the seafloor, and they immediately bounce off the seafloor and are reflected back to the ship. And this allows us to construct maps of the seafloor, which we call bathymetry.
With lower frequency waves, the scientists can actually penetrate the seafloor, so they can see what's going on beyond the bottom of the sea. They can spot potentially dangerous cracks and faults up to a few hundred meters beneath the seabed. The trouble is, most serious earthquakes start deeper, up to 50 kilometers down, and for that, the team needs special sounding devices. Each of these ocean bottom seismometers costs $25,000. They can measure seismic activity deep inside the Earth.
An OBS in the inside has very sensitive sensors which can measure vibrations either in the water or coming from the ground beneath. And these vibrations can be produced either from distant earthquakes or from a seismic vessel which is passing by and producing an acoustic source, that is to say, air gun shots.
They need 30 ocean bottom seismometers for a 300-kilometer route, the Azores-Gibraltar fault zone. This area has repeatedly caused small earthquakes in the past. Each OBS is lowered up to 5 kilometers to the ocean floor. At these depths, there's no movement but the downward drift of marine detritus. It takes thousands of years to add a centimeter to the seabed. But exceptional events leave exceptional traces. At the Marine Technology Unit of the University of Barcelona, they store drill cores from the sea floor that contain remarkable information. Eulalia Gracia and her team work closely with the researchers on the Hesperides. The samples in their cores don't just provide a record of undersea earthquakes, they can even reveal how often they happen. Because quakes trigger avalanches of sand and silt that settle in layers, known as turbidites.
Turbidites are sandy to silty deep-sea sediments. They are deposited very rapidly, from minutes to few hours. These are the hemipelagic mats. They are very fine-grained size sediments, and they are deposited very slowly. For example, this part, it may take thousands of years to be deposited. In contrast, we can see here this abrupt base, erosional base. These are the sands of the turbidite, which it reached up to this height, and it must be, maybe it has been deposited in few hours.
The silt and sediment is organic material, so it's an ideal candidate for carbon dating. Turbidite layers examined here suggest that a huge earthquake has occurred in this region roughly every 2,000 years. That may sound reassuring, but the evidence isn't always as clear as the scientists would like, because a big earthquake can leave a small footprint. That was the case for the 1755 earthquake.
So even if the 1755 Lisbon earthquake had a very large magnitude, the resulting turbidite is very thin. So there is not a direct relationship between the thickness of the turbidite and the magnitude of the triggering earthquake. There are other factors that may be taken into account, for example, the availability of sediments or the stability of the area.
Citizens who went to early Mass are already filling the streets for the great All Saints' Day market. The city's 1/3 population is swollen by thousands of villagers who've walked in from the countryside, ready to spend what little money they've saved on the biggest treat of the year. But Carl Peterson has returned home. Like most merchants, he lives in the crowded Baixa district above and behind the port. It's not especially fashionable, but it's ideal for his work, within walking distance of the warehouses and the harbor. But on a high Catholic holiday, a Protestant like Peterson is best not seen in the streets. And today, he can look after his wife. She's had a fever for nearly a week. There'll be no doctors on All Saints' Day. Meanwhile, out in the market, the animals are panicking. No one knows why. And in Belém, the harmony of the picnic is suddenly disturbed. The king will retreat to his country palace, a decision he will later regret. In the city, the houses start to shake. People described a trembling, as if a heavy coach were driving by outside. They do nothing and lose valuable time. But no one can know what these signs mean. There hasn't been a serious earthquake for 150 years. Somewhere to the southwest, two continental plates suddenly shift with explosive power. Within 2 minutes, the shock waves reach the capital. At 9:40 a.m., every church bell in the city begins to ring on its own. Then the sky falls in. Carl Peterson wrote to a friend, "Suddenly I felt my house, all 5 stories of it, shaking. Stones, beams, and roof tiles fell about me." He's lucky. The house sways, but doesn't collapse. Marquis Pombal has a narrow escape too. The streets are no safer as walls collapse into the narrow alleyways. The tremors continue for 10 minutes, 3 huge quakes with eerie periods of peace in between. Everywhere the reaction is the same, out of the houses, away from the walls and roofs, into the open. The earthquake will destroy 3/4 of the city's buildings, 17,000 houses. The opera house next to the quayside collapses like a house of cards. But most victims are in the churches. The house of God becomes a place of death. The tremors are felt on 2 continents, recorded over 10 million square kilometers throughout Europe and North Africa. At Lisbon's Geological Institute, they've made a special study of the earthquake. Pedro Terriña too works with the scientists on the Hesperides, looking for the connections between faults in the Earth's crust and potential sea quakes.
Faults are fractures, and it is the movement of the blocks on the faults that release elastic energy that generates the shake of the Earth or an earthquake. To create an earthquake like that, we have to release a huge amount of energy. So a small fault cannot produce a big earthquake.
And the 1755 earthquake was big. Lisbon's National Institute of Engineering has one of Europe's biggest shaking tables. This is where they test materials for tremor-proof buildings. There's an earthquake somewhere in the world every day, but on average, only 4 a year actually destroy buildings. Today's test will mimic the enormous power of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The tremors increase as the computers follow the sequence of waves in a real earthquake. The horizontal waves are the first to arrive. They're known as primary or P waves. The secondary waves travel at half the speed, and their action is vertical. This 30 square meter table can create the precise combination of horizontal and vertical vibrations that gives an earthquake its destructive power. Most building materials are brought down by a force 6 quake. The Lisbon earthquake was 1,000 times as powerful.
The exact magnitude of the Lisbon earthquake we don't know, but it has been estimated as a magnitude 8.5, 8.7. This was inferred from the intensity of the earthquake and damage on the different localities in the Iberian Peninsula.
Carl Peterson guides his family through the narrow streets towards the harbour. But then he turns back, uphill to Rossi's Square. This will save their lives. In vain, soldiers attempt to restore order. But thousands force their way past towards the harbour and the royal palace. There's plenty of open space down there. They can wait out the end of the earthquake. But at the harbour, a strange spectacle awaits them. As if the tide has gone out and will never come back. As though the water is fleeing the disaster to make room for the desperate citizens. Today, at the Technical University in Berlin, they can model any sequence of waves that takes their fancy. By pressing a button, they can create giant waves, white walls, or the most deadly waves of all, tsunamis. A tsunami is different from other giant waves because it always gives a warning.
First, the water pulls back. It's almost an invitation to go into the water. Then the first tsunami wave comes. It isn't always the highest. Then the water pulls back again and returns with the hugely destructive waves that, in the tsunami disasters we've witnessed, claim the most victims.
A normal wave, created by tides, sea currents, or strong winds, generally has a wavelength of 100 to 200 meters. It'll break gently on the shore, causing little damage. Tsunamis have a wavelength of 100 to 500 kilometers. That means they carry a colossal amount of water. In the open ocean, they're barely noticeable, but as they near the coast, their height increases dramatically.
Tsunamis are caused by sea quakes, when continental plates collide with each other. Over a broad area, say 280 kilometers in length and breadth, the entire body of water is raised by about half a meter to a meter. This wave races towards the coast at a speed of up to 800 kilometers an hour. As it reaches shallow water near the coast, the wave gets higher, 10, 20, 30 meters depending on the shape of the coastline, and it does terrible damage when it arrives.
On the horizon, a tsunami looks harmless, as these pictures from Indonesia of the December 2004 disaster show. In 1755, several ships encountered the tsunami swell at sea. Sailors said their vessels shook, as if they'd gone aground. There was a rumbling sound, like an approaching storm. For those at the harbor, the tsunami suddenly rears up. These are the malfadados, the unlucky ones, caught between the city in ruins and the raging sea. "900 people perish instantly as the quayside is washed away by the waves. "5 a.m. on the Hesperides. This is a 24-hour job. They're getting the air gun ready. This monster weighs many tons. It's connected to a compressor that provides the shock waves that will penetrate more than 30 kilometers into the seabed. The air gun will fire its ultra-low frequency pulses every 90 seconds as the Hesperides sails above the line of the seismometers.
The air guns make an acoustic signal, which is an explosion, and this signal propagates into the water and the Earth's crust, and then it's recorded by the OBS.
The scientists are looking for distortions and fractures on the seabed that were the result of earthquakes in the past or could cause them in the future. They know what kind of a fault might have caused the 1755 earthquake. One with a big surface area and a huge vertical slip. 3 successive tsunami waves kill thousands on the coasts of Europe and North Africa. They even strike distant Scandinavia, and the surge is felt across the Atlantic in the New World. But the Portuguese capital is hit hardest of all. Artists soon imagined the full horror of the disaster. People barely feature, powerless before the onslaught. Earthquakes, giant waves, and finally a blazing inferno fall upon the city, as if all the elements are conspiring against it. The fires start in the kitchens. Soon they're flaying the homes and warehouses in the crowded Baixa. Anything the quake left standing is now exposed to the flames. Priceless stores of goods and years of business records are destroyed in minutes. There's no point trying to put out the fires, as the squalling winds repeatedly fan the inferno. Within minutes, whole districts are ablaze. And aftershocks continue to shake the city. In the hospital, 400 patients burned to death. By the afternoon, the whole city is burning. Why did the fire spread so fast? Specialists at Montan Technology in Dortmund in Germany carry out tests. They're recreating Lisbon's narrow alleyways in this fire room. Wooden industrial pallets stand in for the buildings of the old city. The distance between them faithfully represents the cramped medieval alleys. How fast will these streets catch fire? How much time will the inhabitants have to escape? The final element is wind. The electric fan is switched on to replicate the northeast wind on the day of the disaster.
Control room to filter system.
Filter system switched on.
The fires are started. At first, the outbreak seems manageable. But then the inferno develops much faster than the experts predicted. Flames from both sides meet in the middle. The street is no escape route. It's a death trap.
Maximum power.
Maximum power applied.
Maximum temperature 760 degrees.
The wind and the confined space turn the blaze into a firestorm.
Maximum temperature in building 2 is 1043 degrees. Carbon monoxide level 0.3% and carbon dioxide 6.2%.
6.2 is 12 times the normal level of CO2, easily enough to kill. And the rubble of collapsing buildings would pump out even more gas.
At such high temperatures, the wood begins to pyrolyze and releases highly toxic gases, including carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. When that happens, a person can die after taking just 2 or 3 breaths.
No one knows exactly how many died that day. The best estimate is between 40 and 60,000, 1 in 5 of the population. On the Hesperides, they're cruising in the area of ocean where they believe the disaster was triggered. Expedition leader Valenti Sayares is on the lookout for a large fault, long and with a big surface area.
There are different relationships between the length of a fault or of a single fault and also the surface of the fault with the magnitude of the earthquake that can generate. And we see that for an earthquake of the size of the Lisbon one, so 8.5, 8.6, should be more than 200 kilometers.
Southwest of Portugal, the Eurasian continental plate collides with the African and the Atlantic plates. The faults here are long and broad. There are several possible sites where plates could shift, rise, and fall.
The 4 fault zones, which are the most likely candidates for having produced the 1755 earthquake, are the Gorange Bank, which is a 5-kilometer high submarine mountain, the Horseshoe Fault, which stretches along this region here. Third, the Marquês de Pombal structure, but which is a bit too small to have produced the earthquake all by itself. And finally, here we can see the accretionary wedge, which is related to an east-dipping subduction zone.
An accretionary wedge is a buildup of rock, and a subduction zone is where one plate slides under another. The combination can be explosive. But none of these locations has yet been proved to be the site of the 1755 earthquake. The complex forces in play can be seen in a 3D view of the ocean floor. The 5,000 meters high Gorange Bank rears above the flat collision zone of the African and Eurasian plates. Drifting over the globe a millimeter at a time, the plates create extraordinary undersea landscapes. Like these fissures and deformations along the Portuguese coast. Here at Lisbon's Geological Institute, they're using data from previous expeditions to recreate the movement of the plates that led to these structures. It looks simple. 2 plexiglass sheets simulate the continental plates. Layers of different colored sand are laid on top. Though the real plates are solid rock, when you're working in miniature, sand is the best material to show how the giant forces of the Earth affect each other. The challenge is to take today's structures and imagine how they came into being, and then test the hypothesis.
He's a little bit like a crime scene investigator, like an homicide detective, because he's confronted usually with an end state of the formation. Like you are in the, you know that the crime has been made, okay? And what you are trying to do is to reconstruct the chronology of events that originated that result.
Every tectonic movement leaves a characteristic pattern. The aim of this experiment is to create a deformation that could qualify as the source of the Lisbon earthquake. The sliding plexiglass plates recreate in minutes what takes nature thousands of years. If two plates glide past each other without friction, little seismic energy is created. But if they get stuck, or as here, one is forced up or down, there's a great deal of strain. A massive amount of energy could suddenly be released.
So we know very well what happens when we have a single thrust and what kind of structures we would expect from this movement like this. And we also know what kind of structures to expect associated with this other kind of structure. So what we are trying really to figure out is what happens, what kind of structures are supposed to form when we have both systems working together at the same time, or at least interfering with each other. And this is why this area is critical. The corner area between the intersection of both these structures is where you would expect the strain to accumulate.
The model confirms their hypothesis. It's not just the size of the fault that matters, but whether the pressure is coming from more than one direction. A combination of forces like this could have released the enormous destructive power of the Lisbon earthquake. In Lisbon, one man ensures the city doesn't sink into chaos. The King's Chancellor, Marquis Pombal, has one maxim: bury the dead, look after the living. He declares martial law. Plunderers and thieves are executed on the spot. He creates field hospitals for the injured and tent cities for the homeless. He has the church's permission to bury the dead immediately in mass graves, unheard of in a Catholic country, but essential to avoid epidemics. If Pombal is everywhere, the king is nowhere to be seen. Plagued by nightmares, he will sleep for the rest of his life only in tents or wooden palaces. He will never spend a night in a stone building again. Inside the city, fanatical priests, led by the Jesuit Malagrida, call the quake the expression of God's wrath. They predict the imminent end of the world.
The origins of the flame you see that burns your treasures are not the comets, not the stars, not the natural phenomena, but your sins, your abominable sins. Listen to me.
The aftershocks continue and the fires burn on for 3 days. Religious processions thread their way through the ruins. Everyone, Catholic or Protestant, must kiss the saints and reliquaries or be punished. Pombal will never forgive the Jesuits for their actions in Lisbon's hour of need. On the Hesperides, they're cruising back along the Azores-Gibraltar fault line to raise the OBSs. Each takes an hour to surface from 5,000 meters below. If the anchor doesn't release on a radioed command from the ship, there's no way to bring a seismometer up. All its information will be lost. On some previous trips, the failure rate was nearly 20%. At $25,000 a time, they can't afford it.
Yeah, you are happy because this always a thriller a little bit when you have this that you don't know if it will arrive or not, and once you see it in the surface, then go there, having it here. You're happy, you're quite happy, but the thing is that you have to repeat this 30 times to be really happy.
In Lisbon, people search the ruins for their belongings. 3/4 of the city is destroyed. That includes the brand new opera house and the royal palace next door, housing the king's art collection. Paintings by Titian, Correggio, and Rubens are lost forever. Pombal orders the troops to clear the debris. Every able-bodied citizen is expected to help too. No one is allowed to leave the city. Unlike the priests, Pombal is sure the earthquake was not a sign of God's fury, but a natural phenomenon. And his response is just as rational. He sends questionnaires to every parish in the country to record the precise time, duration, and severity of the earthquake, the effects of the tidal wave, and the numbers of wounded and killed. This scientifically priceless information is kept in Lisbon's City Museum. The documents don't just show the scale of the crisis, they show how Pombal uses it to become dictator of Portugal. As he protects the population, he consolidates his power, cutting out his rivals. If they don't follow his orders, they will pay the consequences. Officially, the king still rules. In fact, Pombal is now the ruler of the king. Ordinary people in Lisbon are unaware of his takeover. They're just grateful someone has taken charge and given them a reason to hope. Like most of the merchants, Carl Peterson has lost everything. British merchants alone have lost £10 million in the disaster. In today's money, that's more than £1 billion. But Peterson is alive and his family is safe. Three weeks later, news of the disaster reaches other European capitals. Stock markets crash. The disaster also shakes the world of ideas. There's a heated debate over the meaning of the earthquake. Is it a sign of God's fury or the work of nature? For the first time, science dominates the argument. Pombal turns his mind to reconstruction. No new buildings will be erected without his permission. Their height, even the size of windows and doors, is regulated. A new half-timbering system is invented that will take the pressure off the walls in an earthquake. The same principle is still used today. The new buildings, with their half-timbered construction, distribute the weight better, but they're lighter than before, so in an earthquake they will sway more easily. If the resonance set up by the tremors is too powerful, the buildings will still collapse. Pombal carries out endless experiments on model buildings. Only designs that survive the tests receive the Marquess's seal of approval. Lisbon soon has the first earthquake-resistant buildings of all Europe. But this is Pombal's greatest triumph: the expulsion of the Jesuits. They have opposed him for too long, preaching sermons of hate and repentance throughout the nation. Just 2 years after the earthquake, Pombal forces them to leave Portugal forever. for another 22 years, Pombal is the undisputed ruler of the country. Until the king dies, power is in his hands alone. Thanks to his far-sighted plans, Lisbon rises from the ashes. Narrow medieval alleyways give way to the most modern city in the world. A city of broad streets where every house is divided from the next by a firewall, and generous public open spaces. Places of refuge if disaster comes again, which in this turbulent region can never be ruled out. The OBSs have been on the ocean floor for 1 week. In that time, they've recorded all the seismic movements beneath them. Now their data is downloaded. Europe will have to wait a while for an effective early warning system for tsunamis. First, all the potentially dangerous faults must be identified and examined. It would be a real bonus if they can find the fault that caused the Great Quake of 1755.
Integrating all this information together gives a very complete view of the different structures that we have in the area. And this gives quite a lot of information about the different sources or potential sources of this earthquake.
At all the spots they've identified so far, the plates are shifting a few millimeters a year. It'll take a long time for energy to build up to cause another great earthquake. But the potential is there. West of Gibraltar, they've identified a major risk area. This is the subduction zone. It could be the one.
A portion of the African plate is being pushed beneath the European plate. It is this tectonic motion which is the most likely cause of the great earthquake of Lisbon of 1755.
Here it is on the virtual seabed. And this model shows 12 million years of geological history as one continental plate slides under another, building up the accretionary wedge. The horizontal and vertical movement the scientists were looking for. If it caused the Lisbon disaster, we're safe for the time being.
Based on the geological evidence as well as the velocities of the tectonic movements in the area, we believe that such an earthquake happens roughly every 2,000 years.
But there's still no final proof this was the culprit. And that means Lisbon is still at risk. A view of Lisbon from offshore shows how vulnerable the city still is. Pombal made Lisbon safer in an earthquake, but a tsunami today would cause almost as much damage as before. A 10-meter wave would overwhelm the Baixa, just as in 1755. The sooner the scientists have the data to develop an early warning system, the sooner the people of Lisbon and other cities will be protected from the horrors of a tsunami, and the more prepared they will be to cope with the aftermath of an earthquake. High above the Baixa, the ruins of the Campo do Carmo church still show the scars of the disaster. On the morning of November the 1st, 1755, hundreds of people died here when the roof collapsed. The skeleton of God's house is not just a memorial to the past.